In the heart of the city's bustling art district stood one of the most prestigious galleries in the world. The gallery was known not just for its exceptional exhibitions, but for its notorious owner, Victor Langley. With a sharp eye for art and a sharper tongue for those who didn't measure up to his high standards, Victor had built a reputation as a tastemaker in the art world. His gallery was a haven for the elite, billionaires, socialites, art critics, and curators, all of whom came seeking the latest in avant-garde art. If you could make it in Victor's gallery, you could make it anywhere. His name alone was synonymous with success, prestige, and power. Victor was a man who prided himself on being able to tell the worth of a piece of art with a glance. He didn't believe in wasting time on what he considered unsophisticated art. To him, art was about refinement, history, and culture. It wasn't for the unpolished, the raw, or the unrefined. He often dismissed new artists, especially those who didn't come from the right circles. He believed that only a select few had the true ability to create masterpieces, and everyone else was simply trying too hard. His biases ran deep, especially against artists of color. He made no effort to hide it. For him, art was about maintaining an image, and he didn't believe that artists from marginalized communities had the capacity to create works worthy of the high-profile space he had cultivated. He was quick to judge and even quicker to dismiss anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of what art should be. Victor's gallery was filled with the works of renowned artists, many of whom had been dead for decades. His walls were adorned with expensive paintings that had been passed down through generations, their value increasing with each passing year. He had no room for the raw, untapped talent that sometimes arrived at his door. He saw them as intruders, unworthy of the sanctity of his gallery. But one day, Elijah would walk through those doors, and everything would change. Introduction to the artist. Elijah Thompson had always been an artist, though he didn't know it at first. Growing up in a small, run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, he didn't have the luxury of art lessons or a gallery to admire. His early years were marked by struggle, both financially and emotionally. His mother, a hard-working woman, had raised him alone after his father left when Elijah was just a boy. She worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads, and Elijah spent most of his time alone, finding solace in drawing. His early art was born out of necessity, a way to express the chaos of his life. But as he grew older, it became a passion, a fire that burned deep inside him. His paintings told stories, often abstract, filled with vibrant colors and shapes that conveyed emotions too complex for words. He painted about his experiences growing up in a tough neighborhood. About the dreams and struggles that filled his daily life. His art wasn't just for the sake of beauty, it was a way to communicate, to speak out in a world that often ignored voices like his. But the world wasn't ready for Elijah. At least, not yet. His art, though deeply personal and powerful, didn't fit the traditional mold. He was rejected time and time again by galleries that refused to even give his work a second glance. The art world, he soon realized, was a closed door, one that didn't seem interested in anyone who wasn't already a part of it. Yet, he continued to paint. It was his life, his passion, his escape from the world that had so often failed him. Despite the setbacks, Elijah's work began to catch the attention of a small group of people who recognized its depth. His online portfolio gained a modest following. A few local art enthusiasts admired his raw, unpolished style, and slowly, his reputation grew. But deep down, Elijah knew that if he wanted to make a name for himself, he would have to reach a larger audience. And there was no better place to do that than at Victor Langley's prestigious gallery. Elijah's decision to approach the gallery. It took Elijah months to summon the courage to approach the gallery. He had heard of Victor Langley's reputation, how he could make or break an artist with a single word. He knew that getting in front of Langley was a long shot. But the idea of his art being seen by someone of Victor's stature, of having the opportunity to show his work in a space where the world's elite could appreciate it, was too tempting to ignore. One cold afternoon, with trembling hands and a heart full of hope, Elijah walked to the gallery. The street outside was busy, with people milling about, chatting in the crisp air. The gallery was an imposing building, its sleek glass windows reflecting the blue sky above. As Elijah stood outside, staring at the entrance, a sense of unease settled over him. Was he truly ready for this? He had never shown his work to someone so influential, someone with such power over his future. But he had to try. He had come too far to turn back now. He gathered his paintings, each one wrapped carefully in cloth, and approached the gallery's front door. The nervousness in his chest grew heavier with each step, but he pushed it down. He was ready. When he walked in, the contrast between the sleek, polished interior of the gallery and the unassuming artist he was immediately apparent. The walls were lined with expensive art, the floors gleaming under the bright lights. A few patrons walked about, admiring the pieces, while others engaged in quiet conversations with the gallery staff. It was a world Elijah didn't know, a world that seemed out of reach. He approached the front desk, where a well-dressed receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral. I'd like to speak with Mr. Langley," Elijah stammered. "I have some of my work that I'd like him to see." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I'll let him know you're here. Please wait over there." Elijah sat on a plush sofa, his heart pounding in his chest. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if Langley didn't like his art? What if he laughed in his face? He knew that rejection was a part of being an artist, but something about this moment felt different. He couldn't afford to fail here, not after all the years of struggling. The meeting and mockery. It wasn't long before Victor Langley appeared. He was everything Elijah had imagined, tall, sharply dressed, with an air of superiority that radiated from him. His cold blue eyes scanned Elijah's modest appearance, before settling on the bundle of paintings he held in his hands. Well, Victor said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I assume you're the artist. Let me see what you have." Elijah stood, slightly shaking, and unwrapped his paintings one by one, carefully setting them on the table in front of Langley. He held his breath, waiting for the reaction. He hoped that Langley would see the passion and meaning behind the work, the themes of identity, resilience, and self-expression. These were more than just paintings, they were parts of him, pieces of his soul laid bare on canvas. Victor barely glanced at the first painting, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. Juvenile. The colors are all wrong. Too bold. It's messy," he said dismissively. Elijah's heart sank, but he held his ground. "It's meant to be bold," he replied softly. "The colors represent strength and defiance. It's about breaking free from expectations." Victor rolled his eyes, clearly uninterested. "Please. This isn't art. This is amateurish. You might find a market in the street vendors section, but this? This is nothing." He scoffed as he looked at the next painting. "And this one? It's just scribbles. There's no depth, no form. You'll need to try harder if you ever hope to make it in this world." Elijah stood there, humiliated. His hands clenched at his sides, and the sting of Victor's words was almost unbearable. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. He had heard rejection before, he had felt the sting of doubt, the cold indifference of those who didn't understand. But this was different. This wasn't just rejection, this was mockery. And Elijah wasn't going to let it break him. He forced himself to breathe and, with as much dignity as he could muster, spoke again. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Langley," he said quietly. "But I believe my art is worth more than your opinion." With that, he gathered his paintings and turned to leave. As Elijah walked out of the gallery, the weight of the encounter settled on him like a heavy. His mind raced with emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. How could someone so dismissive of true talent be in such a position of power? How could someone so blind to the significance of his work be the very person who held the keys to the art world? But as he stood outside the gallery, staring at the busy street, Elijah's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let Victor Langley define him. He wouldn't let a single man's ignorance determine his future. He would keep painting, keep pushing forward, and one day, the world would see the worth of his work. Elijah's resilience. The rejection hurt, but it also fueled something inside Elijah, a fire that burned brighter than before. He returned home that night, locked himself in his small studio, and painted until the early hours of the morning. His hands worked feverishly, the brushstrokes flowing with a sense of urgency and purpose. He poured everything into his art, each stroke a declaration of his refusal to be defined by others. He would prove Victor Langley wrong. He would show the world that there was more to art than the narrow, elitist view that people like Langley held. Elijah knew his worth. And it was time for the world to see it too. The road ahead was not easy, but Elijah was used to hardship. He had never been one to back down from a challenge. With each new painting, he grew more confident in his ability. And one day, the world would recognize him, not just for his talent, but for the strength it took to overcome the rejection and mockery of those who never believed in him. Elijah was just getting started. After the humiliating encounter with Victor Langley, Elijah was determined not to let rejection dictate his future. He poured his soul into his work, more motivated than ever to prove the world wrong. Every brushstroke, every choice of color, was an extension of his spirit, a reflection of his struggle, his identity, and his dreams. He worked tirelessly in his small, cluttered studio, where the smell of oil paints mixed with the sound of rain against the windows, the quiet hum of city life outside. The world seemed far away, and yet it was all Elijah could think about, how he would make them see him, how he would make them listen. Elijah's journey to recognition began in a way that seemed almost mundane, through the lens of social media. It was the only platform where emerging artists could connect with a broader audience, and although it wasn't the world of high society galleries, it was a world of its own. He created an Instagram account, showcasing his work to the world. At first, it was just a small collection of followers, family, friends, and a handful of local art enthusiasts. But then, something remarkable began to happen. Elijah's paintings started to get noticed. His abstract pieces, filled with vibrant colors and emotive expressions, resonated with people in a way he hadn't expected. His work began to go viral. People shared his paintings, discussing the messages behind them, the deep cultural significance, the way the colors seemed to burst with life, the emotion that poured from every canvas. His followers grew exponentially, and soon, art collectors and critics began to take notice. They were drawn to the boldness of his style, to the authenticity of his voice, and to the fact that he was breaking away from traditional norms. He wasn't afraid to take risks. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. In the art world, that kind of audacity was rare and precious. Collectors began to reach out. Art enthusiasts and curators started to follow him, intrigued by the stories his paintings told. People saw in his work a reflection of their own struggles, their own aspirations. It wasn't just art for art's sake, it was art for the people. It spoke to them on a personal level, a connection that transcended the boundaries of race, class, and culture. Elijah had found his voice, and it was loud, clear, and unapologetic. A breakthrough. As Elijah's following grew, so did his opportunities. One evening, he received a message that would change his life forever, an invitation to showcase his work at a prestigious art exhibition in the city. It was a rare opportunity, one that many established artists would die for. The exhibition was attended by some of the most influential figures in the art world, high-profile curators, buyers, and critics, all of whom were eager to discover new talent. Elijah knew this could be his big break, but he didn't expect the scale of what was about to happen. The night of the exhibition, Elijah arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. His heart raced as he stepped into the lavish venue, a space that had previously seemed like a distant dream. The gallery was filled with some of the most impressive pieces of contemporary art, their colors and shapes glowing under the carefully placed lighting. But it wasn't the established artists who caught Elijah's eye that evening, it was the crowd around his own paintings. People stopped, stared, and whispered in admiration. Their eyes lit up as they took in the intensity of his work. Art collectors, some of the wealthiest in the city, were captivated by the raw energy and depth of his pieces. They were drawn to the emotional power that seemed to radiate from each painting, and before long, several buyers expressed interest in acquiring his work. The prices for his paintings soared, with some pieces selling for thousands of dollars in just a few hours. It wasn't long before Elijah realized that he had done the impossible. He had not only entered the art world but had done so on his own terms. This newfound success didn't just stop at the exhibition. The press took notice, and his name spread like wildfire through art circles. Critics began to write glowing reviews of his work, hailing him as a rising star in the art world. His paintings, which had once been rejected by the likes of Victor Langley, were now in high demand. His work was featured in major galleries and even some prominent museums, and Elijah's once quiet world exploded into the kind of recognition he had never dared to dream of. He was no longer just an artist in the shadows, he was a force to be reckoned with. Gallery owners' dismissal turns into jealousy. Meanwhile, Victor Langley, sitting in his sleek, glass-walled office, began to hear the whispers of Elijah's success. At first, he dismissed it as a fluke, a trend that would surely fade as quickly as it had arrived. After all, how could a young, unknown black artist have such a meteoric rise? It seemed impossible to him. Yet, the more he heard about Elijah's growing influence, the more frustrated he became. How had he not seen the potential in Elijah's work? How had he been so quick to dismiss the artist that now everyone seemed to be talking about? Victor's resentment grew as Elijah's work continued to appear in top-tier galleries, auction houses, and museums. He watched as paintings that had once been in the same price range as those of his own artists sold for tens of thousands of dollars, and even millions, in some cases. The art world, which had once been firmly under his control, was beginning to slip through his fingers, and he couldn't stand it. His arrogance had cost him dearly, and now he was left to watch from the sidelines as someone he had once ridiculed became the hottest name in the industry. The jealousy that festered inside Victor soon began to spill over into his public statements. He tried to downplay Elijah's success, calling it a passing trend and claiming that his rise to fame was due to hype rather than genuine talent. He dismissed the praise Elijah was receiving, attributing it to the whims of an art market that was more interested in novelty than in quality. Victor tried to discredit Elijah at every turn, hoping that by belittling his work, he could regain some semblance of control over the narrative. But it was clear that the tide had turned. Elijah was no longer an artist on the fringes, he was now at the center of a revolution in the art world. Elijah's newfound confidence. As the months passed, Elijah's success only continued to grow. He was no longer just a struggling artist fighting for recognition, he was a sought-after commodity. Major art auction houses began to feature his work, and the demand for his paintings grew exponentially. The prices for his pieces continued to climb, as collectors from around the world sought to own a piece of his history-making art. Elijah's work, which had once been dismissed as juvenile, was now seen as revolutionary. It was bold, it was unapologetic, and it was deeply meaningful. Elijah's newfound confidence was palpable. He no longer second-guessed himself or his work. He had found his voice in a way that he never thought possible. No longer did he feel the sting of rejection or the pressure to conform to the expectations of the traditional art world. He had broken through, and in doing so, he had become a beacon for others like him, artists who had been ignored, dismissed, and overlooked. Elijah knew that he was not just an artist, he was a symbol of resilience, of defiance, and of the power of authenticity. He stopped worrying about the opinions of those who had once dismissed him, including Victor Langley. The gallery owner's bitterness no longer had any hold over him. Elijah knew that his work spoke for itself, and that was enough. He began to take pride in his success, not out of vanity, but because it was a testament to his journey. It was proof that hard work, passion, and resilience could triumph over prejudice and arrogance. The art world takes notice. Elijah's rise to the top was no longer just a story of personal triumph, it was a movement. His success began to change the art world in ways that no one had anticipated. He became a role model for young, aspiring artists, especially those from marginalized communities who had once been told that they didn't belong. Elijah proved that art was for everyone, that it wasn't about fitting into a mold or conforming to a narrow definition of what was acceptable. It was about expressing oneself, about speaking truth to power, and about breaking down the barriers that had long kept certain artists out of the conversation. Major art auctions began to feature Elijah's work, and his paintings sold for millions of dollars. The art world, which had once been a closed and elitist club, now recognized him as a serious, groundbreaking artist. His paintings were displayed in top galleries around the world, from New York to London to Paris. Museums began to feature his work in exhibitions that celebrated his unique style and the cultural significance of his art. He was invited to participate in high-profile exhibitions, where his name was now mentioned in the same breath as the great masters of contemporary art. The world had finally recognized Elijah Thompson, not as an artist who had been lucky, but as one who had earned his place among the most respected creators in the world. His journey was one of perseverance, of proving that art could speak to the world in ways that transcended race, class, and tradition. Elijah had arrived, and the art world would never be the same. Victor Langley's life had always been one of privilege and power. He had built his gallery from the ground up, slowly carving out a place for himself in the upper echelons of the art world. For years, his name alone was synonymous with success, and artists longed for the opportunity to have their work featured in his prestigious space. His reputation was built on the backs of famous artists and the wealthy clients who purchased their work, and his gallery was considered one of the finest in the industry. But things were changing. The rise of Elijah Thompson, an artist whom Victor had rejected so arrogantly, began to rock the art world. Elijah's breakthrough was nothing short of a phenomenon. His paintings, once dismissed as nothing more than juvenile scribbles by the very man who had the power to elevate him, were now featured in some of the most respected galleries and auction houses around the globe. Major collectors, curators, and even high-profile museums clamored for a piece of Elijah's story. His work was being celebrated for its vibrancy, its raw emotion, and its cultural significance. The art world was waking up to something new, something fresh, and Victor Langley, the man who could have been the gatekeeper to Elijah's success, was left behind. As the weeks went by, the changes became impossible to ignore. While Elijah's stock continued to rise, Victor's gallery was increasingly overshadowed by the meteoric success of the young artist. Other galleries, once loyal to Victor's brand of elite art, started displaying Elijah's work. Buyers and collectors who had once frequented Victor's gallery now turned their attention elsewhere. They were no longer interested in the staid, traditional pieces that Victor had championed for so long. They wanted the new, the bold, the artists who spoke to the present and the future. And in this new world, Elijah Thompson had become the face of that future. Victor's gallery, once a thriving institution, began to suffer. His most valuable clients were now making purchases from other spaces, his exhibitions were receiving lackluster attendance, and his name no longer carried the weight it once did. Critics who had once praised Victor as a connoisseur of fine art now openly questioned his judgment, and the gallery's reputation slowly began to erode. People began to wonder if the art world had passed Victor by, and if his refusal to see the value in Elijah's work was a sign that his eye for talent had grown outdated. Victor was a proud man, and to see his empire crumbling before his eyes was a bitter pill to swallow. He could hardly escape the reality of his situation. Each day, as he walked through the gallery's empty halls, he couldn't help but replay the day he had rejected Elijah's work in his mind. The sting of that moment had only grown stronger as Elijah's fame and fortune continued to rise. The worst part? Victor knew he had made a critical mistake. Elijah had been the one who could have changed everything for him. Instead, Victor had dismissed him as insignificant. Now, the opportunity was gone. The owner's attempt to contact Elijah. In the midst of his personal and professional decline, Victor's desperation began to set in. He had never been one to admit mistakes, his entire career had been built on the premise that his judgment was infallible. But now, he realized the magnitude of his error. Elijah's talent was undeniable, and Victor's refusal to acknowledge it had cost him dearly. Driven by a mixture of frustration and envy, Victor made the difficult decision to reach out to Elijah. He needed to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his gallery, and aligning himself with the artist now seemed like his best hope. He knew Elijah had already risen far beyond anything Victor could offer, but he still believed he could get a piece of that success. Perhaps, if he played his cards right, he could secure a partnership, a collaboration that would allow him to regain some semblance of respect in the art community. Victor's email to Elijah was carefully crafted. He started by acknowledging the artist's undeniable talent and the profound impact his work had had on the art world. He complimented Elijah's success, though it seemed almost begrudging, as if Victor was trying to convince himself of the artist's worth as much as he was trying to convince Elijah. He offered a partnership, a chance for Elijah to showcase his work in Victor's gallery, suggesting that they could both benefit from this collaboration. The message felt hollow, a calculated move to salvage what Victor had lost, but he sent it anyway, hoping for a response. To Victor's surprise, Elijah didn't respond right away. Days passed without any acknowledgement of the email. Victor began to grow anxious, checking his inbox repeatedly, each time hoping for a reply that never came. He couldn't believe that someone who had once been so eager to impress him was now unreachable. He tried again, this time calling Elijah's office, but his calls went unanswered. Each attempt felt more futile than the last. Elijah had moved on, he no longer needed the validation of someone like Victor Langley. Gallery owner's public apology. As the weeks turned into months, Victor's frustration boiled over. His gallery was in shambles, his reputation was in tatters, and the world had seemingly moved on without him. The once powerful art dealer was now a shadow of his former self. Desperate to regain some control, he took what he considered his last shot at redemption, a public apology. Victor arranged an interview with a well-known art magazine, hoping that by issuing a formal apology, he could repair some of the damage done to his reputation. In the interview, he admitted that he had been wrong about Elijah. "I did not see his talent," Victor confessed. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. I let my ego stand in the way of recognizing a true artist. Elijah's work is groundbreaking, and I was too short-sighted to see that." The apology was intended to show humility, to make amends for the past. But the problem was that it came too late. The art world had already moved on from Victor's dismissals. The public apology felt insincere, a last-ditch effort to cling to relevance, rather than a genuine acknowledgement of his mistake. Critics and art lovers alike saw through the facade. They recognized that Victor's words were driven more by self-preservation than any real remorse. Elijah, for his part, was indifferent to the apology. He knew that Victor's attempt at reconciliation was born from jealousy and desperation, not from a place of genuine respect. The art world had already made its decision. Elijah's success wasn't just a fluke, it was the result of years of hard work, raw talent, and authenticity. The public didn't need Victor Langley to tell them what they already knew. Elijah had earned his place among the greats, and no amount of empty words could change that. Elijah's reflection on the journey. As Elijah's success continued to flourish, he often took a moment to reflect on his journey, on how far he had come from the rejection and mockery he had once faced. His rise had been neither easy nor straightforward, but it had been worth every struggle, every sleepless night spent painting, every moment of doubt. He remembered the pain of Victor's dismissal, the sting of knowing that someone so powerful had completely ignored his worth. But now, looking at the life he had built, Elijah could only smile. He had done it on his own terms, and in doing so, he had proven something far greater than just his artistic ability. Elijah thought back to the rejection that had initially fueled his fire, the way he had left Victor's gallery with his heart heavy but his spirit unbroken. That moment had been a turning point for him. It had shown him that no one could define his worth but himself. It had shown him that his art was valuable not because of the approval of the elite, but because it spoke to the hearts of those who saw the world in the same way he did. He had proven that talent could not be contained by the narrow walls of tradition or the prejudice of the powerful. Elijah's success was a testament to the idea that authenticity and perseverance could break through any barrier, no matter how high or thick it seemed. And though Elijah could never forget the past, he had learned to move beyond it. He was proud of how far he had come, not because of the fame or the money, but because he had stayed true to himself, despite the world trying to tell him he wasn't good enough. Now, he was in a position to help others, to guide those who had been told they would never make it, just as he had been told. Elijah's continued success. As the years passed, Elijah's success continued to rise. He became a household name in the art world, with his paintings displayed in museums, private collections, and galleries worldwide. He received lucrative offers for collaborations, exhibitions, and exclusive commissions, all of which he took with the same level of passion and dedication that had driven him from the start. He became a mentor to young artists, particularly those from underrepresented communities, showing them that their voices mattered, that their stories were worth telling. Elijah's story became an inspiration, a shining example of how perseverance, hard work, and authenticity could overcome even the harshest rejections. In the process, he became more than just an artist. He became a symbol of resilience, of overcoming the odds, and of challenging the systems that sought to silence marginalized voices. Elijah's legacy was not just in the paintings he created, but in the doors he had opened for others, and the paths he had carved for future generations of artists. Through it all, Elijah never forgot where he came from. He remained humble, aware that his journey was only possible because of the people who had supported him along the way. But one thing was certain, he had risen, not because of the approval of those like Victor Langley, but because he had believed in himself when no one else would. And that was the most valuable lesson of all. Victor Langley had spent decades cultivating an empire. His name had been synonymous with prestige, wealth, and influence in the art world. His gallery, once a beacon of success, had attracted the world's most prominent collectors, artists, and critics. People who wanted to be seen and be part of something exclusive sought out his endorsement. His gallery was the ultimate prize, the gold standard for any artist hoping to make it big. But now, in the face of Elijah Thompson's rising star, everything that Victor had worked for seemed to be slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just that Elijah's work had captivated the attention of the art world. It was that Elijah had done it on his own terms, breaking through the tightly knit networks that Victor had relied on for so long. Elijah's success wasn't just a flash in the pan, it was a revolution, one that had shaken the very foundations of the art world. And as Elijah's paintings were now fetching millions, Victor's gallery was rapidly losing its luster. Victor had once been the gatekeeper to the elite, the man who decided which artists would have a seat at the table. But now, his gallery's roster was dwindling. Collectors who once flocked to his shows now sought out the galleries featuring Elijah's work. His once exclusive list of clients now turned their attention elsewhere, chasing the new, the fresh, the bold. The art world had grown tired of the same old faces, the same traditional pieces, and it was embracing something new, something that resonated with a broader, more diverse audience. Victor watched in horror as his clientele dried up. His exhibitions, once packed with eager buyers, now barely saw any attendance. His once pristine reputation was beginning to tarnish. The art world had moved on, and he had been left behind. Worse yet, his refusal to recognize the significance of Elijah's work, coupled with his dismissive attitude, had cost him a significant opportunity. The art community, which had once revered him, now saw him as a relic, a gatekeeper who had failed to understand the changing tides of the industry. As the months passed, the situation only worsened. The gallery's financial troubles became more and more apparent. Payments for previous works were delayed, and creditors began calling. Victor, usually composed, found himself in panic, grasping at any possible solution to salvage his business. But with each passing day, the gallery became a sinking ship. The prestige that once defined him had faded into irrelevance, and the once thriving business he had worked so hard to build was crumbling beneath him. Gallery owners' desperation. Victor had always been a man who liked to control everything. He prided himself on being able to manage every aspect of his gallery, its artists, its sales, its reputation. But now, faced with the overwhelming tide of Elijah's success, he found himself powerless. The thought of admitting defeat was unbearable, so he decided, in his desperation, to try one last-ditch attempt to regain some control. He needed Elijah. He needed to find a way to secure him, to make up for his earlier mistake. He couldn't bear the thought of watching the young artist soar while his own empire fell apart. Victor reached out to Elijah, not with the impersonal emails or messages he had sent before, but with an offer he hoped would catch Elijah's attention. He knew that the young artist had reached a level where his work could fetch millions, and in Victor's mind, the only way to salvage his fading business was to bring Elijah back into his fold. He offered Elijah an exclusive contract, a deal that would guarantee him a piece of Elijah's success. The terms were lavish, lucrative compensation, international exposure, and promises of massive support from Victor's gallery, which was still, in his eyes, one of the most prestigious in the art world. Victor's letter was carefully worded, meant to appeal to Elijah's ambition. He portrayed the offer as a chance for Elijah to cement his place among the elite, alongside the great masters of the art world. He even tried to sweeten the deal by implying that this could be the key to ensuring Elijah's long-term success. "We can work together to make you an even bigger name," Victor wrote, "and I would be honored to support your continued rise in the art world." Elijah, however, saw through Victor's desperation. He had come too far to fall into the trap that had once been laid for him. He was no longer the unknown artist seeking validation, he was the artist in demand, the one who held the power now. Elijah had built his reputation on his terms, and he had learned the hard way how to navigate the complexities of the art world. He knew that Victor's offer wasn't about helping him, it was about trying to salvage Victor's own dwindling career. Elijah declined the offer, politely but firmly. He had no interest in partnering with someone who had once dismissed him and his art. There was nothing in Victor's offer that could undo the damage done, no amount of money or promises that could erase the arrogance of the past. For Elijah, the decision was simple, he didn't need Victor Langley to succeed. Elijah becomes a gallery owner. With his decision to reject Victor's desperate overtures, Elijah took a bold new step, one that would forever change the course of his career and the trajectory of the art world. Rather than relying on someone who had once rejected him, Elijah decided to open his own gallery. This wasn't just a space for his own work, it was a space for all artists who had been overlooked, rejected, and underestimated by the traditional art world. Elijah's gallery was a testament to his belief in inclusivity, authenticity, and empowerment. It was a space where emerging artists, particularly those from marginalized communities, could display their work without the barriers and prejudices that often plagued the traditional galleries. Elijah wanted to create a platform for voices that had been silenced, a space where talent was recognized for its merit and not its conformity to outdated expectations. The opening of Elijah's gallery was a monumental moment. Word of the opening spread like wildfire through the art world, and soon, collectors, critics, and art enthusiasts from around the globe were eager to see what Elijah had created. The gallery's first exhibition was a massive success, showcasing not only Elijah's own paintings but also the works of several young, underrepresented artists whose names were just beginning to be recognized. The exhibition was a hit, with several pieces selling for record prices, and Elijah's gallery quickly becoming the talk of the art world. As the months went by, the gallery continued to thrive. Artists who had once been told their work was too risky or too controversial now found a home in Elijah's space. The gallery became a hub for creativity, for art that challenged the status quo and spoke to the times. Collectors who had once sought out Victor's gallery now flocked to Elijah's, eager to purchase works from the next generation of artists. The success of Elijah's gallery only fueled his growing influence in the art world, and soon, he was being hailed as one of the most innovative and important figures in contemporary art. The owner's fall from grace. While Elijah's star continued to rise, Victor Langley's career spiraled further downward. His gallery, once considered one of the most prestigious in the world, was now a shadow of its former self. The art world had moved on, and the collectors and curators who had once filled his gallery's halls now looked elsewhere. Victor's once legendary eye for art was now seen as a relic of the past. His refusal to embrace the changing tides of the industry, and his failure to recognize the worth of Elijah's art, had cost him not just a valuable artist, but his entire business. As the financial troubles continued to mount, Victor was forced to make difficult decisions. He could no longer afford to keep the gallery open, and after several failed attempts to secure new artists or buyers, he was left with no choice but to sell the gallery. It was a painful decision, one that symbolized the collapse of everything he had worked for. The sale of the gallery was bittersweet. Victor had poured his heart and soul into building it, but now, he was forced to let it go. The art world, once his domain, had turned its back on him. The reputation he had built through years of careful curation and exclusive relationships now seemed irrelevant. He was no longer seen as a tastemaker, but as a cautionary tale, a man whose arrogance and bias had led to his downfall. Elijah's final triumph. As Victor's career crumbled, Elijah's continued to soar. His gallery became one of the most respected spaces in the art world, known not just for the caliber of artists it represented, but for its commitment to inclusivity, diversity, and breaking down barriers. Elijah's success was a testament to the power of authenticity, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. One day, as Elijah prepared for another major exhibition, he received a letter. It was from Victor Langley. In a rare moment of humility, Victor asked if he could attend the exhibition. He wrote that he had come to realize the error of his ways, that he had finally understood the value of Elijah's work, and that he wanted to pay his respects. Elijah knew that Victor had never truly changed. He had not come to genuinely acknowledge his mistake, but rather out of a need to salvage his own ego. However, Elijah, in his newfound power and wisdom, decided to offer him a taste of his own medicine. He invited Victor to the exhibition, but not as a guest of honor, but as a reminder of what had happened. The moment was symbolic, the final twist of fate in the story of a man who had once sought to crush Elijah's spirit, but had failed. As Elijah stood in front of his gallery, surrounded by the art and the artists who had trusted him, he knew that his triumph wasn't just about success. It was about the power to redefine the rules of the art world, to prove that talent could overcome prejudice, and that perseverance could conquer all.